I am very excited. I haven't given this presentation before, so it's brand new. This is a theme that really excites me. In particular, my research for the last 20 years has been on virtual reality, but in the recent years, I've moved more towards medicine and personal health. As I was introduced, I recently moved to the Technical University of Darmstadt, where they have a center for cognitive science. And I think it fits very much with the last presentation. It's a lot about artificial intelligence and how to use artificial intelligence to support humans. As we all know, humans are more intelligent than machines, and the future is really artificial intelligence supporting humans' efforts. So today I'm going to quickly start by telling you an outline, especially because I'm used to giving a presentation that's all about my own research, but I want to tell you about state of the art in virtual reality. And so some of this work is not my own, but rather what's the state of the industry. And I can speak very quickly, especially now with the time pressure. If you find you can't understand, you can just say, slow down, or raise your hand, okay? And I'll try my best. So first, I want to introduce what exactly is virtual reality from my perspective. What do I mean by digital selves, specifically often in my world referred to as avatars? Then I'd like to do an overview of the current technology and the vision for this technology, why there is so much interest lately. Then in terms of my own research, I'm going to talk about my personal motivation for why this technology can have an impact in medicine, as well as some of my own research in the last 5 years that I've done with anorexia patients and stroke patients. Finally, I'm going to talk about some of the scientists that I admire the most that have some leading examples of virtual reality applications for personalized health. And at the end, I'd like to tell you about some of the greatest presentations and publications on ethical considerations of this kind of technology. So first, what is the vision of immersive virtual reality? Well, definition-wise, it's a computer simulation of real or fictional environments with which users can interact with objects, intelligent agents, and other people in the space. So this is not a new vision. The ideal future virtual reality technology, not the current state of technology, engages multiple senses and the entire body. So it's not just focused on audio and visual, but it also involves the hands, and it involves the whole body acting in space. So for those of you that are old enough or that are interested in science fiction enough, what you should be thinking of is the holodeck. And here you see the holodeck. There's two people in a relatively small room on a spaceship. And what they can experience is each other in the holodeck, as well as a massively large virtual room. And in that virtual room, there are also all kinds of other people. And to these two users of the system, it's hard for them or indistinguishable for them to determine if those virtual agents are real people or are intelligent agents. So that's really the vision of what many pioneers and many people interested in virtual reality see. So what's with the recent popularity of virtual reality? You can attribute almost all of the recent popularity in virtual reality to these three images, basically. Mark Zuckerberg and Palmer Luckey from Oculus. So Facebook had the biggest investment, $2.1 billion in acquiring Oculus. And they had a cooperation with Samsung where they have this Samsung Gear VR. So at this point, I'd like to ask, how many of you own a VR headset? I think this will be a small number, but some of you, great. How many of you have seen a VR headset, say, in the last few years or ever? So I'm glad to see that. We are informatics conference, so that's good. I recently asked that to about 1,500 audience of about average 18-year-old. They were about 18 years old. And I was super impressed that basically everyone raised their hands. Now, 5 years ago, you couldn't even ask that question. People would say, where should I have seen this technology, right? It's very expensive. So now the leading head-mounted displays today are really the HTC Vive. Of course, Sony PlayStation had Project Morpheus, and they've sold quite a lot of Sony PlayStation VR headsets. You can see them in Saturn or MediaMarkt. Typically, they have a setup where you can actually demo the technology. And of course, it's not just virtual reality, but also augmented reality. So Microsoft has a huge investment in this technology, and one of the best setups, which is the Microsoft HoloLens. So I said VR really isn't new, and VR headsets and 3D viewers over time are extremely not new. So this is a slide that I kindly borrowed from Stephen Ellis, a scientist formerly at NASA Ames Research and now retired. And you can see that actually 3D stereo viewers go back hundreds of years, and even headsets that look technology-wise quite similar to the ones that are being sold today have been around really even starting before the personal computer. And then really with the invention of the internet and in the 90s and late 90s to the 2000s, there was an explosion of head-mounted displays. And then, as I said, the recent popularity results in 5 million of these Gear VRs being sold. And I haven't updated these slides, but the Oculus Go is now only $200, and it's a standalone headset that doesn't require that you put your smartphone into the headset. And so the numbers will be soaring in terms of devices that people can have in terms of headsets. But I'd like to ask quickly, what's all the fuss about VR? Because it's been around really since the 60s. And the big fuss, I would say, so one of them is the Sensorama, a really a fascinating system that engaged all the senses. So it was a video game in an arcade. But the big deal is that 10 years ago, when I came to Germany and had to build up my own virtual reality lab here, it cost me 25,000 euros to buy a headset. And those of you that know anything about this technology, that headset was only vision. It didn't involve tracking. It didn't know where my head was in space. That system cost millions. So really, you had very expensive devices that only scientists and pretty much only scientists and military and people invested in the future of the technology could afford. And today that cost, as I just said, now I should update this, it costs $200 up to $1,500. You can get a very nice experience. And that decrease in cost came with a tenfold increase in quality and in design and functionality. And the major thanks was to the competitive smartphone and digital games and social media markets. So here you see a bit of the Sensorama, but I don't have time for that, so we'll go forward. So there's also a big interest in companies lately, because all of them are getting involved. Google, Amazon, obviously Facebook, Microsoft. There's a huge interest in this device as a new platform. And I think one of the major reasons is that these devices have the potential to give unprecedented personal data about users' behavior to the manufacturer of the technology used. And the smartphone, of course, already does a lot of that. But the VR headsets can tell the companies, or can tell the user themselves, where their body is moving, so their parts and the body as a whole. So where are they in their house? Where are their parts relative to their center? It can tell about eye movements. There is a lot of research on emotional state from those factors and other physiological factors, heart rate, decision making, and of course, preferences in everyday behavior. So one of the videos that I think really captures this is shown here.
This is the story.
And it's a sales advertisement.
Hi, my name's
from
Jace.
Samsung.
I'm what is known as a fly-in, fly-out worker, and I'm 4,000 kilometres from home. This means I'm going to miss the birth of my third child.
Flying in and flying out, they're really hard on the workers and the families.
It's tough, but in the long term, it's definitely going to benefit us.
There's been times when it's been really emotional and hard to think about going through it all on my own.
Jace and Alison may be on opposite sides of Australia, but with Samsung technology, they're about to be brought together in a whole new way.
I've just got the call from Alison, and she's on her way to hospital, so I'm excited to go and watch the birth.
As Alison went into labour, we set about creating the world's first live virtual reality birth using Samsung Gear VR.
Got the memories on the wall for me.
In a matter of seconds, 4,000 kilometres disappeared.
Oh wow.
And two parents were able to share one of life's most profound moments.
So if you turn to your left,
Yeah, I can see your mum.
see mum.
Yeah.
Wave.
Hello. Hello, Rosemary.
He says hello.
That's good. That's good. It's going to be all right.
I can't see his face, but who do you reckon he looks like? Or
He looks like,
completely different?
I think he looks like you. Healthy. healthy boy, healthy mum. I got to see it, so nothing better than seeing your baby for the first time.
The other day when we actually dropped him off and he actually had said, the next time I see you, you have our baby in your arms. And yeah, it was hard to hear that, but that's amazing at the same time.
Hello boys, how you doing?
So I like to show this video because it captures in a 2-minute sales video really this, and this was about 4 years ago. It was released to the public to promote the Gear VR, this headset that's been sold 5 million times today. And I like to show it because it captures so well the work of scientists, of which there's many, but I see the 2 leading ones to be the Swiss scientists, Professor Daniel Thalmann and his wife Nadia Magnet-Thalmann and Mel Slater, that have been working on this theme for over 20 years. And it's basically about being there and being together. And the comments here is that Samsung Gear VR enabled them to experience the birth of their son together, even though they were thousands of kilometers apart. That's what you saw. And the mother, Allison, could speak, look at, and interact with the father throughout the entire birth. So it was more than Skype. I mean, they illustrated that by the fact that he could look around by her direction, right? He couldn't control where he was in the space, but he could look around and experience the space in an immersive way. And I think most notably that when they met each other in the airport, that he really had the feeling that this was the second time he met his son, right? It wasn't that he had, of course it was only a week later, but he really had already seen and met his son more than you might imagine he would have felt if he received a picture or someone was Skyping him in through the space, right? So I think that shows the vision of virtual reality. Certainly this isn't happening so easily today, and if you read the disclaimer in the video, of course a lot of technology went into setting that up, not just this $100 Gear VR setup. So, but what about virtual reality in medicine and science? And here I just want to tell you a little bit about my background and why I was interested in medicine in the first place. I actually, when I was an undergraduate research scientist, I had the fortunate case of working with surgeons at the Penn State Hershey Medical Center. And there I worked on VR applications for minimally invasive and image-guided surgery. And very shortly, what I'd like to say is what I learned was that virtual reality devices have a tremendous ability to help educate and train future medical practitioners. And that's not what I'm talking about today, but it is a profitable area of VR. So in fact, of course, most people think what's profitable in virtual reality and technologies, and the immediate thing they come to mind is gaming. Of course, gaming drives a lot of our markets. But in virtual reality, it's been over 10 years that the market has been quite competitive and profitable for education of medical training simulators and evaluation of surgeons. And I learned there that you can actually, through VR, really empower professionals to do well, and that their experience, their perceptual experience, was really important. From there, I went to the University of Utah, where I continued to work with hospitals, but I found out something more, which was that using virtual reality, here was a rather sophisticated treadmill, you can manipulate behavior. So just by doing some very small manipulations in this VR treadmill, what I did was very simple. I was a runner, so I was interested in motor control and behavior. And all I did was had people run in an infinite hallway. And if I made the hallway go faster or slower, I could speed or slow up the user without them knowing. So I learned a little bit about how perception and immersive experience can control behavior. So, yeah, is it? That's not working, I guess. Thanks. Okay. Sorry, I didn't notice that. So, and then I went on to work at sensory information about the own body and how that influences the way we perceive space. But since I've been back in Tübingen, I worked at the university, or I worked with the University of Tübingen and the Max Planck Institute for Perceiving Systems. I got back to patients, and that is namely what I'm going to tell you about the anorexic patients as well as stroke patients. And I began to see that you could use this technology not just for training medical students, as I had done 20 years ago, but also you could do it to evaluate patients and to understand them in a personal way, the individual patient, and to diagnose them, and also for therapeutic applications. And you'll see some of that work. That's what I'll be talking about here in the next minutes. And that's where I'm investing most of my time now, is to try to study humans, but investing it in bringing it back to the hospitals and improving the situation for the therapist or for the medical practitioners, and ultimately for the patients, as many diseases are very personal and have very personal pathways. So back 20 years ago, when I was first studying medical education, I had the fortunate case of going to a conference called Medicine Meets Virtual Reality. In the very first year I went, it was 1999, Richard Satava became an award, and he's really can be very much credited. He's now an emeritus professor at the University of Washington, but I'd say he's a pioneer of virtual reality in medicine, and also this thing that he called the virtual patient, or because his funding came very much from the military, often referred to as the virtual soldier. But he meant it in a patient way. And here are some of his slides. So I've made it blue in the background so you can see these are with his permission, slides. And he called it the Holomer Total Body Scan for Total Diagnosis. And I was really inspired by this vision that Richard Satava had. And he actually still gives keynotes, and the slides are very much the same. 20 years ago, he envisioned that you would have a scan of a person, including the internal scanning of a person. And in this case, he talks about dog tags, basically, so virtual soldier, that he would at all times have on him his digital record of his health, right? So that at any time he could, if he needed help, the person in the field helping him medically would know his history, would know, would have information that could help them to help the patient, to help the soldier. And I think I talked about it, I think, yesterday at dinner with a few people, but of course this is also envisioned for us. And I think anybody that has experience going to multiple doctors, you often wish that you could have your own data organized, as well as couldn't the system have that data organized, right? And so Richard Satava went on to talk about, because he was a surgeon, so he's really interested in surgical, even trauma response. And he talked about the total integration of surgical care. So the preoperative planning data, the intraoperative navigation, so navigating the space with that data, simulation and training, so using that data to train on the patient. Can you imagine if your doctor could actually train on your data before going ahead with you and find that thing that's difficult before actually in operation? And then also in terms of all the different devices, robots that are making it into the surgery room, he wanted it to be fully integrated. And I really like this slide, this next slide from him that talks about the fact that healthcare, and I think it still holds today, although I debate whether it's the only industry, but it is kind of surprising that they don't have a computer representation of its product, or what it's capturing, right? And its product is data on us, right? And so he argued that in terms of his surgical room, that a robot in that room that's assisting the surgeon is not a machine, it's an information system with arms. And a CT scanner or any other scanner that's collecting data on patients is not an imaging system, it's an information system with eyes. And he argued that the operating room, or you can imagine the hospital if you want to extend it to more than just the surgery, should be an information system with eyes, hands, and it should be able to integrate this into the virtual patient. So now in my work, actually, I don't do, although I keep up a little bit on all of the great scientists, and Ulm actually has good scientists looking at internal models of humans, of patients. But I actually work more on digital selves and avatars. And I want to ask the question, well, what exactly is an avatar? And present that before I go into my work. Now, if you ask the general public what an avatar is, the first thing that will come to mind, because of its groundbreaking sales, really, and being one of the most successful, or the first successful 3D movie, is they'd say, oh, the blue, avatars from this movie. Now, she's not an avatar, of course, because she's an alien species. But an avatar is something that embodies something else. And so Jake, actually, in this story, was the avatar. And I'd like to show you a sort of making of that movie. But avatars are often referred to as a digital representation of the user player. But again, if you go back to my vision of virtual reality, it's not just digital, it's not just vision, it's everything. It's haptics, it's the whole experience. And I'd like to now talk about what do the avatars look like currently in the industry. Of course, there's a separation. They don't work so well, and they're not at the end vision. This is one company called VTime, the VR sociable network. And here you see basically that people can create an avatar that they like from any possibility. So they're not having an avatar that is a scan of them or represents them, but then they can very quickly meet with people that they know in different destinations, right? So they can very quickly through VR equipment interact in all kinds of different virtual environments, and they can have a constant representation of themselves. So that's a very common avatar representation in industry. We'll go on to Google Altspace, which is, has a nice promotional video here. And again, the avatars don't look that good, but
On the East Coast, we talk, and we have a good relationship, but it's not the same as looking at you. Much nicer to be able to see him every day.
It's really important for me to stay connected with my family.
Any kind of relationship needs two things, love and attention.
I don't know.
My favorite thing in the world is to have my loved ones connect with each other.
Oh, I'm right.
I miss you too.
I know, just put your arms out. Put your arms out. I'm giving you a virtual hug right now.
Wait, is that really a frisbee? Yeah, I'm holding
Who's holding
frisbee.
it?
That's me. I got 5 over 5.
oh, sorry.
And I drew something. Look at that.
Yeah, so we don't need to watch all of this, but this is just showing through Gear VR that people can actually communicate with one another.
I love the wedding pictures, by the way. They're beautiful.
And what they do with each other.
Hey, Dad, are you there?
And then maybe the most famous one is the next one, actually, the one that kind of is the most sexy in the advertisement. Here we don't need actually sound, so I'm sorry that the sound's not coming through so well for you. What you see here is someone on the left who's designing their avatar. And quite famously for Facebook and for Oculus Research, Mark Zuckerberg did a first selfie of him with his wife. She was on Skype or some kind of their own internal Skype. And the picture in the background was their family home, right? And so again here, this theme of being together was the main thing. So now finally getting to my research, what do my avatars look like? So what I typically do these days is I put people in a head-mounted display and I put 5 sensors on them, on their back, on their hands, and on their feet. And I very often use what I call a virtual mirror paradigm because that's very many of my experiments. And so this person is looking in the mirror and he or she is scaling himself to be the right size, so he can actually adjust the body to be the right size. And importantly, he or she can look forward or look down and see a virtual representation of their own body. Now this actual body that you see there is an artistic rendering, but you'll see that we also do body scans, similar to what you saw in Professor Kramer's talk earlier. So, and why do I use digital selves and worlds? Well, I think it provides a really unique research tool. So here's one of my first implementations, which was putting on 50 reflective markers on people, and then I could animate an avatar in real time and let them look at it or look in a mirror. Why do I use it? Because it provides a really unique tool to let people to look down where I can manipulate everything they see. And you'll see that that becomes really important in my clinical population results, which I'll get to now. The clinical populations of interest are many that I work with, eating disorder patients, anorexic nervosa specifically I've worked a lot with, and we work with bulimic patients as well. I work with individuals that vary significantly from the average person, so most all of you wouldn't fit under any, well, certainly any of these categories, maybe perhaps endurance athletes, but people that have bodies that are very different from the average population, such as people that are severely obese, that have significantly different makeup of their bodies, such as endurance athletes, and as well, since I moved to Darmstadt, I work with amputees. And finally, I work with stroke patients because stroke patients, as you may all know, have often a paralysis, even sometimes, hopefully, it's short-lived paralysis, but they do have paralysis. And in some rare cases, they actually have a very strange experience of their body, such as they don't experience their hand as their own, or they can't attend to some part of their body or some part of space. So I work with them as well. I'm going to tell you about just the anorexic and briefly about what we do with the stroke patients. I'd like you just to watch this video, which is often how the press portrays anorexic nervosa in the media. So this is a woman, or young woman, looking in the mirror at her body. You can see it's a little bit low quality probably for you, but you can see she's not too excited about looking at her body. She's not enjoying this experience. She's evaluating. And only when you zoom out, you can see that this person is deathly thin. And this is work that I do in collaboration with the Psychosomatic Institute at the University of Tübingen, as well as the Hertie Institute there with Professor Katrin Giel and Stefan Zipfel. And this conclusion that the press conveys, and that we may all have, any of you that have heard about anorexia nervosa, thinking that they perceive their body as bigger than it is, that they see themselves as being fat, it really comes from the literature as well. It's not just the press making stories up. It's not just us trying to find an explanation for a very terrifying mental illness or disease. It also comes from the literature, and I want to show you the very best stimuli that's used here. So I'll show you some other stimuli in the next slide. But this is a recent paper, actually the end of 2016, that was published. And what I think is a bit laughable about what's being done here is that they ask participants which body is theirs, which body do they identify with, which body do they want. But the stimuli was captured from a healthy individual. And what happened was, to make it fatter, or what they call 50% bigger or 50% smaller, they used Photoshop Expand. So they picked a point in the middle of this body, and they expanded it outwards, or they expanded it inwards. And you all know that when we gain and lose weight, we don't do that, right? We don't certainly expand. The other literature expands us just this way. It's just an aspect ratio expand. And so this woman doesn't look fat. And this woman looks thin, I guess. But she doesn't look unhealthy. She certainly doesn't look like the woman on the left in terms of anorexia nervosa, which you might imagine if you get 50%, say, thinner, you certainly would look a bit more like the unhealthy low BMI. So some other related methods use this kind of stimuli, where they even use personal images of the patients or of the people being, the healthy people being evaluated. They take a picture of them, and as I said, they just use aspect ratio. But they try to take care of some things in terms of what clothing they wear, so that this isn't so obvious, this manipulation that's being done. Here you can see something the same thing. These were actually videos, so you get some dynamics. But I would say we can do better in computer science these days, certainly with the last talk. And what you'll see with our technology, we can do better. But the literature doesn't convey what the press send out as a message. They say that through multiple measures, accurate self-body size perception is observed for the healthy, so for all of us. At least mostly it's done in female populations, so I can say females. And a slight overestimation is reported in the literature for anorexic nervosa patients. So the press idea expands on that, it kind of over-exaggerates. But the literature, and there is a lot of it, says that anorexic nervosa patients see their body as bigger. And it's even in the DSM-4, so it's a diagnosis criteria that they perceive their body, they experience their body as bigger. So what did we do? Over the last 5 years, we actually used a sophisticated body scanner, not unlike what you saw in the previous presentation. I like to call it kind of Connect or depth sensors on steroids. It's actually medical grade scanners or medical grade depth sensors that capture a person. And what you saw there was a 3D mesh. And what we need to do in order to manipulate that body, like I talked about in terms of the aspect ratio, but to manipulate it in a better way, is a couple things. We need to have a registrated mesh so that we can actually manipulate it, each mesh in an algorithmic way. So this is one of my first PhD students, registered mesh to her body scan. We want the patients to identify with it, so we also need to have a texture or a color map of their body. So these are all the cameras that we can extract that from. And beyond that, we need to have a statistical body model that can tell you what happens. If I took a scan of any one of you, what's statistically most likely to happen if you lost 5 kilos, right? So I can't, if I don't have data on you, I can't say how you would look if you lost 5 or 10 kilos. But I could say if I had, and we do have 2,000, or we have 2,000 males and 2,000 females. We have other data that expands into 10,000 scans. We can make predictions about how your body would gain and lose weight. And that's exactly what we did for the anorexic patients as well as healthy controls. And so here you see, again, my most recent graduated PhD student and variations of her body. So this is plus and minus 20% weight of her. And you can see on the left is an anorexic patient without her color information. She gave us permission to use the body, but it's not her color identity. And you can see that we can rather realistically add 20% BMI or lower to 20% BMI for the stimuli. What's further is that we can do it in 3D, so we actually put people in a virtual mirror scenario. This time I don't put them in a head-mounted display, or I don't always put them in a head-mounted display. I put them in a stereo display where they can look at their body. This is another PhD student on the left, at their body, and I can do psychophysics with the response, which is also very nice. that I can ask them time and time again, is this your body? And I've just manipulated a little bit of that body. Or, as you can see on the right, I can ask them to manipulate the body with a joystick to make it so that it is their body in terms of weight. Now, I don't need to just do it in weight. I could do it in anything, right? I could make it in height, and I do it in other dimensions. But of course, for anorexic nervosa patients, weight is the most relevant piece of information. So we did this with 22 patients, as well as 22 healthy controls. Importantly, healthy controls for anorexia, they can't be exactly the same because it's not healthy to be 15 BMI on average. So they're healthy controls that are matched for age, for education, but not for BMI. So what we have in our population is 22 participants that had an average BMI of 15 BMI and were diagnosed in anorexic nervosa. They were inpatient, they were in-hospital patients, and they were approved to go onto our campus to do this study. Then actually the controls were 22 BMI, so as low as you could go basically without having them diagnosed on average as being anorexic nervosa. And the publications are by Molbert and Piriankova et al. And what did we find? So when we asked people to estimate the body, so the psychophysical study where we showed them hundreds of bodies that varied in weight and said, is it your body? Is it your body over and over again? What we found was not what's supported in the literature. What you see here is that the anorexic nervosa picked a body that was slightly thinner, so 14 BMI, as did the healthy controls. They have 21. They pick that to be their body. So we see no difference in terms of their estimated body for anorexia patients as well as the healthy controls. And we've done this in other studies as well, so we feel fairly confident in this result. Now, importantly, when you talk about desired body, we also ask them to do that. We ask them to adjust the body so that it was the body they wanted to have. What you see here as well is that both healthy and anorexic patients want to be thinner. In fact, if you look at this, healthy patients want to be percentage-wise more thinner. But it's important to note that anorexic patients want to be deathly thin, right? This is really in a danger zone. This doesn't let them out of the hospital, right? This is not their goal that they're working on with their therapist. And so we don't want to make light of this disease, but we want to emphasize that it's not that they see their body as bigger, right? So we don't really believe, they probably experience their body differently, but on average, we're not seeing that anorexic nervosa patients have visual perception that's different than healthy controls. What we do find in other studies is that they likely have a disturbed evaluation of their body. So it's not disturbed in visual perception, but it's disturbed in the terms of how they think about and the words they use to describe their body. So now I want to briefly, before I move on to stroke patients, I want to talk about obesity, because a lot of, I hope you find the work that we do with anorexia interesting, but it's a small population. And if we're all lucky, we won't encounter it, right? If we're lucky with our children, with our friends, it's less statistically likely than a very prevalent thing that is in the same space in terms of eating behavior and eating disturbance, and that is obesity, and in particular with children. So I'd like to tell you quickly about someone else's work and work that I would like to start working on myself, which is motivated by the fact that childhood obesity and obesity in general has reached epidemic proportions in parts of the world. So rather recently, I think 3 or 4 years ago, the world tipped to a world that had to worry about hunger in parts of the world to a world that had to worry about overeating, right? So people on average eat too much food, and this is only a recent trend that on average that happened. And in particular, children are eating more and exercising less. Now, the irony isn't lost on me in the fact that I'm interested in virtual reality and smartphones, and it's part of the reason, right? It might be the main reason, right? And so this is why I'm also motivated, because I love this technology for some things, right? I love it for medicine. I love it as a scientific tool. I've benefited greatly. I've learned a lot myself, and my colleagues have. But children in particular, and thankfully I think a little less so here in Germany, but when I go to America, I'm shocked by this, just how much it is. Increased time spent watching television or using computers, and now I've shown you these headsets, right? So they're going to be completely immersed, right? Potentially if parents allow it. And this lack, coupled with poor dietary habits, has led to significant increases in children with type 2 diabetes, with predisposition to hypertension, coronary artery disease, and others. So it has a humongous impact on medical fields. Now, there are some wearable and pervasive technologies that are trying to make an impact in this field. I think it needs a lot of investment from scientists and people that are interested in how to use this technology. So there's over $200 billion a year of consumer spending on health and fitness. That doesn't just include these pervasive technologies, but also fitness studios and things like this. Fitbit, for example, is valued at $6.2 billion. That was in the summer of 2005. You have things like the Apple smartwatch and integrated with a Wi-Fi scale so that you can keep track of all this data. Now, I think the future will bring, and again, as you saw in the last presentation, and as what you can maybe see there on the left is the Alexa Echo Look, more and more we're going to have what's kind of I would term as virtual reality technology or computer vision technology in the home and surrounding us that can track not just adults but also children and track their full body movements and eye movements also for little kids. So you have some programs, some technology that knows how long and how often your kid is sitting, and as well as yourself, like how long you're stationary. And so I'd like to say just one presentation that was made 2014, but there's a whole area, whole conferences in this direction. But this is one presentation that shows a bit about this. And I think I'll just talk through it because I know it quite well, and I think the audio isn't so good. What I love about this project, it was a camp, it was a VR installation, made at a camp where students were there for some period of time. And what he just did was he put a Fitbit in his pocket, and he goes outside, and he's doing his normal activities at the camp. Now, what he's been told is that he will get rewarded for more activity. So he's going to play a game, and he was introduced to that game beforehand, which is called this virtual, mixed reality virtual pets, is what it was called to him. It's a virtual pet game. And then when he comes back from being outside, maybe on the way to lunch, maybe when he feels like it, depending on how they do it, he plugs in his Fitbit or he sits his Fitbit, and now he can interact with this virtual pet. Now there's a couple interesting things here. So the more he walks, then the game gets unlocked. He can do more things with this pet, right? And he sees that. That does not explain to him. That's just what he experiences over the weeks that he is using this device. As well, his pet is unhealthy if he's unhealthy. So he notices, oh man, my pet is really panting, or he can't even jump anymore. At first he could. So they actually build in this relationship, this kind of knowledge that, hey, these kids are gonna play games. They're gonna wanna play games. And if we send them to a camp and there's no technology, then it's gonna be a big challenge for them to go outside and be active. So let's try to get them active and get them motivated and give them a reward. So and you can see this kid, and they talk about it in this video. It's from the University of Georgia by a student, Johnson et al. And colleagues. He does it on his own that he runs because he wants to see what happens when he does that, right? He wants to see he's not told what the motivation is, but he's like, ooh, what do I get now? Because I've done something that's beyond my limits. And what you see in this thing is that's just a Fitbit, but there's also now Connect, so it's actually tracking his movements there. And so this is kind of in the world of this kid's world. He's at home playing a lot of video games, and here now he says, oh, these video games can actually be integrated with my life, right? And I don't have to let go of them to understand that there's healthy motivation. And I think I like this as well because there's this relationship to this avatar of a pet, right? Because this pet does represent that person. There's a relationship there. So I like that work. If you want to see more work like that, I don't have time today, but there's more research in the direction of, there's conferences called Virtual Reality for Good or Games for Good, as well as serious games conferences that have gems like this. They're challenging. They have challenges to how to implement them. The study that I just showed you, this mixed virtual reality for pets, was so great because it was integrated with a camp and it was set up in such a way that a technology person didn't need to be there all the time. So it was robust enough that the students could just be introduced to it, the camp counselors could be introduced, and it could run for a 3-week period in a camp. But that's a real challenge still today with a lot of the technology. So now to move on, as I just want to try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, I've done work with stroke patients as well. Now with the stroke patients, our aim is to look at how they perceive their arm and leg length, because I mentioned that they have paralysis and often a disturbed experience of how and if they can move their hand. So some of them they have paralysis, but they deny in their body model that they think they can still reach, and they're sort of shocked when they can't. Now for them, we didn't give them a body scan. What we did instead was roughly individualized avatars. So we made an avatar that was roughly 65 years of age. We made it male or female. We made it look older. We gave it its weight and specific dimensions. And I bring up this slide because this work is primarily driven by Professor Michael Black at the Max Planck Institute for Perceiving Systems. And he has a lot of resources online so that you can see how good these body models are. In particular, this one is called bmivisualizer.com. And you can quite quickly make a body that roughly maps to your body. Now, I was impressed by this project, although I can't show you the results today. We're still working on it because we brought virtual reality technology, these headsets, into the intensive care unit for stroke patients. And that's a humongous challenge. A person has just had a stroke, and within 24 hours, they have a VR headset on, right? Now, for future generations, this might not be such a barrier, but for today, you have a 65-year-old who's maybe never seen this technology before, and you're asking him to do tests. And also, it's just very challenging because our tests need to be done in 10 minutes, right? We have a 10-minute window where we can evaluate this patient. So as I said, what we did here, though, was simply they looked up into a mirror, so that we rendered their whole hospital room so that the room looked the same as it was there. They looked up in a mirror, and they were asked to adjust the leg and the arm until it matched their own arm. We were asking the question, do they perceive their body correctly? Now, I'm going to move very quickly through just giving you some hints to the people that I admire the most in industry. I mentioned that I'd like to talk about virtual reality applications that are pushing the envelope in terms of getting this to help people, not just my own space, which is basically research-driven. The company that I respect the most is also one of the top 10 funded virtual reality companies in the world, and it's from Switzerland. It's called MindMaze, and you have to go to mindmaze.ch to get it. It's led by a graduate of Olaf Blanke's lab, Tej Tati. And they're actually doing the hard work of getting stroke rehabilitation tools into the hospital so that these patients that I'm assessing, that I said I assessed within 24 hours, actually have technology that can enable the nurses and enable the person themselves to do movements with their arm so that they have a better chance to recover from paralysis, recover more quickly. They do two things: rehabilitation of stroke patients, that is diagnosis, so measuring how much they have. They do personalized training. They do gameplay, extremely easy. That is, they try to motivate the patients to continue the service. And I think the biggest challenge they face is to get this technology to be turnkey so that it doesn't break and that anyone can use it. So I'm very impressed with their company. And now I'd like to move on to two scientists that I respect quite a bit. The first is Skip Rizzo, and I have a picture here of Mel Slater as well. And this is a very brief video, or I think relatively brief video, that describes some work from Skip's lab using the Oculus HMD. So again, I think I'll...
Built with a dazzling attention to detail. But the technology is now being adapted to become a rather unlikely tool. Scientists across the globe have been experimenting with VR to provide therapy for some serious mental health issues. And thanks to years of intricate research, many issues are now being addressed in groundbreaking ways.
That's how it's always the press. It's always groundbreaking, right? But Skip has been working for really probably 20 to 30 years. In particular,
for example, for many people, everyday
in particular on anxiety-related issues and post-traumatic stress issues. So here what you see is the fear, the phobia of crowds, of transport, so a lot of anxiety-related issues. I think later what you see, and I'll skip ahead just for the sake of time, you see some work, and this is really what Skip is famous for, although he's doing so much these days beyond that, is post-traumatic stress disorder. So people that were in the military that come back and can't get integrated and can't deal with the experiences that they had, for, in this example, in Iraq. So for the sake of time, I'll go forward, but if you're looking for personalized health in the mental health direction, Skip Rizzo is really a wealth of knowledge. Mel Slater did something recently that is also, I think, brings up a lot of ethical questions, but it's also super interesting, and that is that he wants to use virtual reality to bridge the gap between when people can get in with a therapist. So he basically wants you to be able to put on a headset, and it might sound really silly, but to talk to yourself about your problems and to counsel yourself and give yourself encouragement. I'll quickly show you what this looks like here. And in this particular case, Mel's talking about social anxiety, so a person who's very critical. She has a hard time going into a coffee shop to buy something because she's very nervous interacting with other people. And let's see. So that's her talking. And what she does is she actually talks about what she's nervous about, and then she sees it from her virtual therapist perspective. Then she tries to give herself advice as if she was hearing a friend, because Mel's argument is that we're much better at counseling our friends and giving them advice than we are able to objectively see our own advice. And then she goes back into her body and she hears it again from the therapist, where they've just manipulated the voice to make it sound male or female, if that's the case, depending on the patient's gender. And this video is extremely nice because it talks about, although I don't want to take the time now because I'm running out of time, it talks about, how is that experience different than working with a therapist? They also, BBC interviews a professional therapist, and of course she expresses concern that this isn't a replacement for therapists, but it might be something that helps kind of reiterate the information that the therapist provided to the patient so that they can kind of hear it again and again and not lose sight of their goal to actually improve their social anxiety. So now very quickly in the last few minutes that I have, I'd like to summarize, as I said, the ethical research out there. So there's a very famous, maybe many of you know him, Thomas Metzinger from Mainz, a famous philosopher that works in virtual reality. This is actually written by an American, Michael Matteri. And I love this research article for two reasons, basically. I mean, maybe there can be considered the same reason. They actually evaluate virtual reality technology, in particular the avatar side of things, this sort of body swapping thing that I just mentioned where you could swap with a therapist. And more importantly, it's a code of conduct that's written for both scientists and developers, so people like us that think in the world of science and scientific advancements, but it's also written for consumers. And I make every one of my students read this, and I particularly like it because it's 15 pages or something, but there's one table which is just summarizing all of their conclusions from the literature. And I'm going to quickly tell you the 3 statements that they say in that paper. It's not excluded that extended interactions with virtual environments may lead to more fundamental changes, not only on a psychological, but also on a biological level. And I think that's really true. From my own experience, you can really change behavior using virtual reality. And I think the more we reach the vision, the more this will become true in many different ways. There's a comprehensive character of VR plus the potential for the global control of experiential content introduces opportunities for new and especially powerful forms of both mental and behavioral manipulation, especially when commercial, political, religious, or governmental interests are behind the creation and maintenance of virtual worlds. I think that's extremely true. I've done VR for 20 years. One of the most powerful experiences I've had is to sitting down at a table with Bill Clinton, who had a message to sell for the Clinton Foundation, and he did it well because he had a lot of money to build a VR experience, and his message was, at the face of it, to give money to the Clinton Foundation to support his effort, but it was a very powerful experience, and I think that it's a very powerful platform to sell whatever message you want to push forward. Finally, VR technology directly targets the mechanism by which human beings phenomenologically identify with the content of their self-model. I said I love VR because, particularly in the kind of science I want to do, because it enables me to investigate the bodily self and how we experience our body. But it also has an extreme amount of power to manipulate that and to target those mechanisms, which are not at all fully understood. So quickly, what do they say for code of conduct for scientists? That scientists that use this technology, like doctors, they have to have a motivation to do no harm. They have to think about the fact that every time they do a demo or an experiment, they do no harm. They have to have informed consent, of course, but informed consent means that you're informing people not only of the known risks, but risks that are largely unknown and possibly foreseeable. That you have transparency and media ethics, so you be careful not to create a false hope. In my research with anorexic, that's extremely important. We're moving towards therapy, and I have had phone calls upon phone calls of people saying, could you send me something? Could it help me, right? And I don't know. I don't know yet. The research isn't there. And there is a hope that this technology might help them to to treat themselves better, to treat their bodies better. So you have to clearly assert the risks of VR and what's known and what's not known. Of course, very popular in the European Union when writing grants and thinking about issues, and I think it's super important, is that there's always going to be dual use for this kind of technology. There's military, there's political, there's all kinds of dual use that could be taking advantage of the technology. So you have to realize that the technology is not just a media. It's not just a passive viewing thing. Of course, also make sure that people can always determine what is real. So VR, AR, mixed reality, that you convey to them what is real and what is not. And then, of course, they mentioned that there's limitations of any kind of code of conduct. So they may have missed, right? They're just saying they may have missed some things. Now, finally, for the general public, and I think they should write this article every 5 years. Maybe there are also ones that exist for artificial intelligence, of course. But they warn that although scientists might not tell you about it when they do studies, or when you go into, demo the latest VR technology, you should know there's nothing known really about long-term immersion. Most experiments, including my own, are done in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So if you're letting your kid or teenager, or if you're 20 years old buying a Gear VR and watching Netflix, which is a common thing to do now, for hours, there's nothing known about what that does. That's a real warning. One scientist has looked into this, and I think there will be more in the coming years, but nothing is known. There's also the possibility for the neglect of the social and physical environment. So if you have this Gear VR, you might actually just forget about the world around you. There's also risky content that can be really scary when it's in an immersive setting. So, I should have also probably warned you that you would see a baby be born, right? In VR, you could see people get killed, and it might be different than seeing them get killed in a movie, right? And of course, very important, privacy. Now, actually, back to the person I told you that got me excited about using virtual reality for medicine. In 1999, he had a slide about the ethical concerns for medicine, for VR for medicine, and he asked these questions. Should we do research in areas we may not be able to control? That is, genetics, cloning, nanobots, intelligent machines. Will prolonging life through technology result in more disease in the overall population? Can we change medicine from treatment to prevention of disease? In defeating diseases, will technology change a human into a combination of man and machine? And what does it then mean to be human? So I hope you agree with me. He was very inspirational, asking questions that are, of course, again, very important that we ask today. So finally, I'd like to leave you with my take-home message, which is that the success of this immersive virtual reality selves and worlds technology relies on bridging the gaps between so many things. Creative content, so you need to be able to have worlds and digital selves, VR and AR hardware, 3D computer graphics, computer vision, as you saw in the last talk and from my talk as well, multi-sensory experience, human experience, realistic self-avatars, evaluation of the user experience, ethical concerns, data privacy, and of course, if you can bridge all these gaps and you bring multiple disciplines together for this technology, my main message is that immersive virtual reality has a huge potential to influence personalized health and medicine. I'd like to quickly acknowledge that these are the main scientists that I've worked with within my research group. Of course, also, I can thank many collaborators and funding. And then I just bring it back to this take-home message. And I think we probably only have time for very few questions.
Vielen Dank, Betty. Also was ich ganz interessant fand, war mit diesen ethischen Leitlinien oder Code of Conduct, weil wir machen ja derzeit in der GI, überarbeiten wir auch die ethischen Leitlinien neu und es gibt ja auch ein ACM und IEEE. Code of Conduct, hat es damit irgendwie zu tun oder ist es komplett separat?
Ich habe das auch für IEEE gelesen, die IEEEs für diesen letzten Kongress, das ich hatte organisiert, IEEE Virtual Reality. Ich glaube, das hat die gleichen Ideen natürlich, das ist sozial und wie wir machen das, aber diese Code of Conduct war mehr für spezifisch zum dieser Technologie. Ja, das war nicht wirklich die Social Interaction, aber ich glaube, das ist seltsamer. Ja? Die Motivation für Kongress und Cooperation zum dieser Code of Conduct, wie wir sprechen miteinander und was wir machen, und das ist klar. Aber für Technology, ich glaube, das ist ganz oft, dass die Leute sieht das als behindert für die Wissenschaft und das ist gar nichts. Das ist irgendwie so, ich finde, was Metzinger hat geschrieben, das war so wichtig, weil das sagt, guck, hier gibt ein paar Beispiele, das sind super wichtig und du sagst alle, ah ja, keine Sorge, keine Angst, aber das ist so wichtig für dieses Thema zum Weitergehen. So, ich glaube, das ist ein bisschen anders.